I was cleaning out my classroom desk when Principal Davidson walked in with Security Officer Martinez trailing behind him like a shadow of impending doom. The afternoon light streamed through my windows, illuminating stacks of final essays I'd never get to grade and copies of To Kill a Mockingbird. That would soon be removed from my shelves forever, Ms. Martinez. I need your keys and your school ID badge, Davidson said, extending his hand with the cold efficiency of someone who'd clearly practiced this conversation. Your access to campus is being revoked effective immediately, including the graduation ceremony this weekend. After 17 years teaching high school literature at Jefferson High School, I thought I'd weathered every controversy that could befall an English teacher. I'd survived parent complaints about challenging books, administrative pressure to teach 2 standardized tests, and budget cuts that eliminated library funding. But nothing had prepared me for this moment. You're banning me from my own students' graduation? I asked, looking at the security officer who refused to make eye contact. Students I've taught for 4 years. Students whose college essays I helped write. Whose Shakespeare performances I directed. Whose love of literature I helped nurture. The school board has determined that your presence would be disruptive, Davidson replied, using the careful language of someone trying to avoid a lawsuit. Given the recent controversy surrounding your curriculum choices, the recent controversy was my decision to include books by Black authors, LGBTQ+ writers, and immigrant voices in my advanced placement literature curriculum. Books that challenged students to think critically about identity, justice, and the human experience. Books that some parents had decided were inappropriate and divisive. What Davidson didn't know was that my students had been planning something that would make my absence from graduation impossible to ignore. What none of them anticipated was that in 72 hours, 87 of my students would refuse to walk across that stage, turning what should have been a celebration into the most powerful protest our conservative town had ever witnessed. Because sometimes, when they silence the teacher, the students find their own voice. Let me give you the complete picture of Jefferson High School and how I ended up being treated like a dangerous radical for teaching literature that reflected the diversity of human experience. I'm Rebecca Martinez, and I've been teaching high school English since 2007. When I was 26 years old, with a master's degree in English literature and dreams of inspiring students to discover the transformative power of great writing. I'd grown up in small-town New Mexico, the daughter of teachers who valued education above all else, and I'd chosen teaching because I believed literature could open minds and change lives. Jefferson High serves 1,500 students in grades 9 through 12 in Millfield, Georgia, a town of 25,000 people in the rural southeastern part of the state. Our community was predominantly white and conservative, with strong religious influences and traditional values that had remained largely unchanged for generations. The school building itself was a sprawling complex of brick structures from different eras. With my classroom in the newer wing that had been added in the 1990s, my room was on the second floor, with large windows that looked out over the student parking lot and the football field where Friday night games brought the entire community together. Over 17 years, I'd transformed my classroom into a literary sanctuary that celebrated the power of words to illuminate truth, challenge assumptions, and connect us across cultures and experiences. The walls were lined with bookshelves, containing everything from classical works by Shakespeare and Dickens to contemporary novels by authors like Toni Morrison, Sandra Cisneros, and James Baldwin. Inspirational quotes from great writers covered the walls. Maya Angelou's "There is no greater agony than bearing an untold story inside you," and Harper Lee's "You never really understand a person until you consider things from his point of view." My desk was perpetually covered with student essays, creative writing assignments, and college recommendation letters I was helping seniors craft. Despite our community's conservative nature, I'd built something extraordinary at Jefferson High. My advanced placement literature classes consistently achieved some of the highest test scores in the state. Students regularly received college scholarships based on essays I'd helped them develop. Many went on to become English majors, journalists, lawyers, and teachers themselves. More importantly, I'd developed a reputation for reaching students who thought they hated reading and helping them discover books that spoke to their experiences and opened their minds to new perspectives. The shy freshman who found her voice through poetry, the struggling senior who discovered that literature could help him process his parents' divorce, the gifted student who realized that great writing could come from authors who looked like her and shared her cultural background. My teaching philosophy was simple. Literature should reflect the full spectrum of human experience, and students should see themselves and others represented in the books they read. This meant including works by writers of different races, ethnicities, sexual orientations, and socioeconomic backgrounds alongside the traditional canon of predominantly white male authors. For most of my career, this approach had been quietly successful. Students engaged more deeply with diverse texts, class discussions became richer and more thoughtful, and test scores improved as students connected personally with the material they were studying. But Millfield's political climate had been shifting over the past few years, influenced by national debates about education, race, and cultural values. What had once been accepted as good teaching practice was now being scrutinized through an increasingly polarized lens. The trouble started in September when I introduced my AP Literature seniors to The Hate You Give by Angie Thomas, a powerful novel about a teenage girl who witnesses police brutality and finds her voice as an activist. The book had won numerous awards, was frequently taught in high schools across the country, and dealt with themes of identity, justice, and moral courage that perfectly aligned with our curriculum standards. The first complaint came from Margaret Whitman, whose daughter Ashley was in my third period class. Whitman stormed into Principal Davidson's office, demanding to know why her daughter was being forced to read divisive political propaganda that promoted anti-poly sentiment. This book is clearly pushing a liberal agenda, she declared during a meeting that Davidson insisted I attend. It's making my daughter feel guilty about being white and teaching her to distrust law enforcement. This isn't education, it's indoctrination. I tried to explain that the novel was a work of fiction that explored complex social issues through the lens of a compelling coming-of-age story, and that literary analysis required examining different perspectives and challenging assumptions. But Whitman wasn't interested in educational objectives or critical thinking skills. Davidson, ever the politician, promised to review the curriculum and ensure that all materials align with community standards. He suggested I provide alternative reading options for students whose parents objected to specific books. This seemed like a reasonable compromise until I realized that community standards was code for removing any book that dealt with race, sexuality, or social justice issues that might make some parents uncomfortable. Over the next month, I received complaints about James Baldwin's If Beale Street Could Talk, Sandra Cisneros' The House on Mango Street, and even Harper Lee's To Kill a Mockingbird. The situation escalated in November when I assigned The Miseducation of Cameron Post by Emily Danforth, a novel about a lesbian teenager sent to conversion therapy. The book had won awards and dealt with themes of identity, family, relationships, and the courage to be authentic to yourself. Within days, I was called to Davidson's office for another curriculum review meeting. This time, he was joined by Superintendent Karen Wilson and School Board member Robert Hayes, whose son was in my AP class. Ms. Martinez, Wilson began with patronizing tone, "We've received numerous complaints about inappropriate materials in your curriculum. Parents are concerned that you're exposing their children to sexual content and promoting lifestyles that conflict with their family values. The book deals with sexual orientation in the context of a coming-of-age story." I replied, trying to maintain professional composure. "It's no more explicit than many classics we teach, and it addresses important themes about identity and self-acceptance that resonate with many students." "But that's exactly the problem," Hayes interjected. "You're normalizing homosexuality and undermining parents' ability to guide their children's moral development. That's not your job as an English teacher. My job is to teach critical thinking skills through literature that reflects the diversity of human experience," I said firmly. "Students need to engage with different perspectives and challenging ideas if they're going to be prepared for college and careers in a complex world." The meeting ended with a directive to submit all future reading assignments for administrative approval, and to provide alternative assignments for students whose parents objected to specific books. But the final straw came in March, when I was told that I would no longer be allowed to teach AP Literature at all. My classes would be reassigned to other teachers, and I would be moved to remedial English courses where controversial texts were less likely to be an issue. "We think this will be better for everyone," Davidson explained, with false sympathy. "You'll have fewer parent complaints, and students who need basic skills development will benefit from your experience." Translation: "We're demoting you for teaching books that make some parents uncomfortable, and we're disguising it as serving struggling students." I knew this was retaliation for refusing to sanitize my curriculum, but I also knew that fighting it directly would likely result in termination. So I made a decision that would change everything. I started documenting every conversation, every complaint, and every administrative directive that compromised educational quality for political convenience. The breaking point came during a faculty meeting in April, when Superintendent Wilson announced new district-wide policies for curriculum transparency and parental oversight. The policies required teachers to submit detailed reading lists for administrative approval, provide trigger warnings for any content that might be considered sensitive, and offer alternative assignments for students whose parents requested them. These policies ensure that parents remain the primary influence on their children's moral and cultural development. Wilson explained to a room full of teachers who looked like they'd been slapped. Education should support family values, not challenge them. After the meeting, I was approached by several colleagues who were equally frustrated with the increasing censorship and political interference in their classrooms. Math teachers were being told not to use word problems that mentioned evolution or climate change. Social studies teachers were prohibited from discussing slavery in ways that might make white students feel uncomfortable. That's when I made the decision that would end my career at Jefferson High, but ignite something much more powerful. I decided to teach one final unit on banned books, using the very texts that had been removed from my curriculum as examples of how literature has historically been suppressed by those who fear its power to illuminate truth and inspire change. For 2 weeks in May, my AP Literature students read excerpts from The Hate U Give, The Miseducation of Cameron Post, and other books that had been deemed inappropriate by parents and administrators. But we didn't just read them, we analyzed why they'd been banned, what ideas they contained that made some people uncomfortable, and how censorship throughout history had been used to suppress voices and perspectives that challenged the status quo. The unit was incredibly powerful. Students wrote essays comparing modern book banning to historical examples of censorship. They researched the reasons books like 1984, The Catcher in the Rye, and Beloved had been challenged. They created presentations about authors whose works had been suppressed, because they dealt with uncomfortable truths about society. Most importantly, they began to understand that the books being removed from their curriculum weren't being banned because they were poorly written or educationally unsound. They were being banned because they encouraged critical thinking about issues that some adults preferred not to discuss. But word of my banned books unit spread quickly through our small community. And by the third week of May, my phone was ringing constantly with angry calls from parents and threats from school board members. The final confrontation came during an emergency school board meeting called specifically to address my insubordination and violation of district policies. The meeting was held on a Thursday evening with an overflow crowd of parents, students, community members, and local media packed into the high school auditorium. Ms. Martinez has deliberately violated direct administrative orders, announced Board President Patricia Morrison, reading from a prepared statement. She has continued to expose students to inappropriate materials despite clear directives to modify her curriculum. This represents a pattern of insubordination that cannot be tolerated. I was given 5 minutes to defend myself before the board voted on my disciplinary action. I became a teacher because I believed in the power of literature to expand minds, build empathy, and prepare students for a complex world, I said, looking out at faces that ranged from supportive to hostile. Every book I've assigned has educational value and deals with themes that help students understand themselves and others. The only reason these books are being called inappropriate is because they deal with experiences and perspectives that some people would prefer to ignore. But that's exactly why they don't belong in our schools, interrupted Board Member Hayes. Education should reinforce community values, not undermine them with divisive political content. Whose values? I asked. And what makes one perspective more valid than another? Are we preparing students for a world that includes only people who look like them and think like them? Or are we preparing them for the real world, where they'll encounter different races, religions, sexual orientations, and life experiences? The room erupted in applause and boos, with clear battle lines drawn between those who supported intellectual freedom and those who wanted education to reflect only their personal beliefs. The board voted 4-1 to suspend me for the remainder of the school year and ban me from all school-related activities, including graduation. I was escorted from the building that night by security. My 17-year career at Jefferson High effectively over, but what happened next would prove that sometimes the most powerful lessons happen outside the classroom. That night, I sat in my living room surrounded by boxers of teaching materials I'd packed from my classroom, feeling like my entire professional identity had been stripped away. 17 years of building relationships with students, developing curriculum, and fighting for educational excellence. And it had all ended because I refused to pretend that literature should only include voices that made everyone comfortable. But my phone had been ringing constantly since news of my suspension spread through the community. Students, parents, former colleagues, and community members were calling to express support and outrage at the school board's decision. Ms. Martinez, this is Emma Rodriguez from your third period AP class, said the first voicemail I listened to. I just wanted you to know that what happened to you isn't right, and we're not going to let them get away with it. Ms. Martinez, this is Jake Miller's mom, said another message. Jake has learned more in your class this year than in any other English class he's ever taken. We're disgusted by how you've been treated. But the most surprising call came from Marcus Williams, a former student who'd graduated 5 years earlier and was now finishing his junior year at Georgia Tech. "Ms. Martinez, I heard what happened, and I had to call," he said. "Your class changed my life. You taught me that literature isn't just old white guys writing about old white guy problems. You showed me that stories can come from anywhere and speak to anyone. I majored in English because of you, and I'm planning to become a teacher because I want to do for other students what you did for me." But the most powerful response came from my current students, who had watched their teacher be punished for encouraging them to think critically and engage with diverse perspectives. 3 days after my suspension, I received a call from Emma Rodriguez, the senior class president and one of my most thoughtful AP literature students. "Ms. Martinez, we've been talking, and we want to do something about what happened to you," she said. "The seniors are really upset that you won't be at graduation, and we think it's wrong that you're being punished for being a good teacher." "Emma, I appreciate the support, but I don't want you students getting in trouble because of my situation," I replied. "You've worked too hard to let this controversy affect your graduation." "But that's exactly the point," she said. "You taught us that sometimes you have to stand up for what's right, even when it's difficult. You taught us that literature has power because it challenges us to think about justice and moral courage. How can we just sit there and pretend everything's fine when you're being silenced for teaching us those lessons?" Over the next week, Emma and a core group of senior students began organizing what they called a literary resistance to protest my suspension and the censorship of their curriculum. They reached out to classmates, underclassmen, parents, and community members who supported intellectual freedom in education. The plan they developed was both simple and powerful. Students would boycott the graduation ceremony unless I was allowed to attend, and the banned books were restored to the curriculum. "We're not asking for anything unreasonable," Emma explained during a conference call with student organizers. "We just want our teacher to be able to see us graduate, and we want future students to have access to the same diverse literature that helped us grow as thinkers and human beings." The boycott gained momentum as word spread through social media and local news coverage. Students created a Facebook group called Stand with Ms. Martinez that quickly gained over 1,000 members. They organized peaceful protests outside the school board office, carrying signs with quotes from the banned books and wearing t-shirts that said, "Reading is not a crime." Local media began covering the story as an example of the national debate over education, censorship, and parental rights. The story caught the attention of civil liberties organizations, who offered legal support for both my case and the students' right to peaceful protest. But the most powerful moment came when I received a letter signed by 87 graduating seniors, nearly 60% of the entire class, stating their intention to boycott graduation unless their demands were met. "Ms. Martinez taught us that literature has the power to change minds and challenge injustice," the letter read. "She showed us that great writing comes from all backgrounds and speaks to universal human experiences. She encouraged us to think critically, question assumptions, and stand up for our beliefs. If she cannot be present to see us graduate, then we choose not to participate in a ceremony that celebrates our education while punishing the teacher who educated us best." The letter was delivered to Principal Davidson, Superintendent Wilson, and each member of the school board, along with copies to local newspapers and television stations. Graduation day dawned bright and clear. With perfect weather for the outdoor ceremony that had been planned for Jefferson High's football stadium, families began arriving early to claim good seats, and the atmosphere should have been festive and celebratory. Instead, it was tense and uncertain as everyone wondered whether the student boycott would actually materialize, or if the seniors would ultimately choose to walk across the stage with their classmates. I watched the live stream from my living room, surrounded by flowers and cards from supporters, feeling a mixture of pride and heartbreak as I saw the students I'd taught for 4 years, preparing for a moment I couldn't share with them. The ceremony began with the usual pomp and circumstance: the processional music, the national anthem, and speeches from the valedictorian and salutatorian. But as the time came for students to walk across the stage and receive their diplomas, it became clear that something unprecedented was happening. When Principal Davidson called the first name, Sarah Adams, there was no response. The second name, Michael Bennett, also received no answer. As he continued down the alphabetical list, it became obvious that the majority of the senior class was simply not present. Of the 147 graduating seniors, only 60 answered when their names were called. 87 students, including the valedictorian, the salutatorian, the class president, and most of the National Honor Society members had carried through with their threat to boycott the ceremony. The stadium was filled with empty seats where families had expected to watch their children graduate. Parents sat in stunned silence as they realized their children had chosen to sacrifice this milestone moment to protest the treatment of their literature teacher. But the most powerful moment came when Emma Rodriguez, the class president who had organized the boycott, stood up in the senior section wearing her cap and gown and began to speak without being invited to the podium. "We are not here today because we believe that education is about more than just receiving a diploma," she said, her voice carrying across the stadium with remarkable composure. "We are not walking across that stage because the teacher who taught us the most about thinking critically, questioning authority, and standing up for our beliefs is not allowed to be here to see us graduate." Security began moving toward Emma, but she continued speaking. "Ms. Martinez taught us that literature has power because it tells the truth about human experience in all its complexity. She showed us that great writing comes from all backgrounds and speaks to universal themes of justice, identity, and moral courage. She was punished for teaching us to think, and we refuse to celebrate an education system that silences teachers for doing their jobs well." By this point, the stadium was in complete chaos. Some families were applauding Emma's speech, while others were booing and demanding that she be removed. Media cameras captured every moment of what was becoming a nationally significant protest. "We will return to receive our diplomas when Ms. Martinez is allowed to return to her classroom and when future students are guaranteed access to the diverse literature that helped us become the thinkers and citizens we are today," Emma concluded before security could reach her. The ceremony continued with the 60 students who chose to participate. But the empty seats and the national media coverage told the real story of the day. The boycott had succeeded in drawing attention to the issues of censorship and educational freedom in ways that no traditional protest could have achieved. The aftermath of the graduation boycott was swift and dramatic. The story gained national attention, with major news outlets covering it as an example of student activism in the face of educational censorship. The school district faced intense scrutiny from civil liberties organizations, education advocates, and media commentators who praised the students for standing up for intellectual freedom. Within a week, the school board called an emergency meeting to address the crisis. The district was facing potential lawsuits from civil liberties groups, negative publicity that was affecting the community's reputation, and pressure from state education officials who were concerned about the precedent being set for curriculum censorship. More importantly, they were facing a problem they hadn't anticipated. Many of the boycotting students were refusing to pick up their diplomas until their demands were met. This meant that college-bound seniors were at risk of having their admissions delayed or revoked if they couldn't provide proof of graduation. The meeting was packed with students, parents, community members, and media representatives. Emma Rodriguez and several other student leaders were given the opportunity to address the board directly. "We're not asking for anything radical," Emma said, addressing the 5 board members who had voted to suspend me. "We're asking for our teacher to be treated fairly and for future students to have access to the same quality education we received." Ms. Martinez didn't push any political agenda. She taught us to think critically about literature that reflects the real world we're going to live in. Other students shared their experiences in my classes, describing how exposure to diverse literature had helped them develop empathy, critical thinking skills, and a broader understanding of human experience. The board also heard from parents who supported the students' position, including several who had initially opposed some of the books but had come to understand their educational value after discussing them with their children. Faced with continued negative publicity and the practical problem of students refusing to accept their diplomas, the school board voted 3-2 to reinstate me for the following school year and to restore the challenged books to the AP Literature curriculum. The board recognizes that there were misunderstandings about the educational objectives of the literature curriculum, Board President Morrison said in a carefully worded statement. "We believe that students, parents, and teachers can work together to ensure that curriculum serves educational goals while respecting diverse community perspectives." It wasn't exactly an apology, but it was a victory for intellectual freedom and educational integrity. The boycotting students agreed to participate in a makeup graduation ceremony held the following weekend, where they finally walked across the stage to receive their diplomas. I was invited to attend as an honored guest, and the emotional reunion with my students was one of the most powerful moments of my teaching career. Today, 3 years after the graduation boycott that changed our community, I'm still teaching at Jefferson High School. Though the experience fundamentally changed how I approach my profession and my role as an educator, the boycotting students have gone on to colleges across the country, where they've continued to demonstrate the critical thinking skills and moral courage they developed in high school. Many have become student leaders, activists, and advocates for educational freedom on their campuses. Emma Rodriguez is now a junior at Emory University. majoring in English and education, with plans to become a high school teacher herself. She credits her experience organizing the boycott with teaching her that students have more power than they realize to create positive change. Martinez taught us that literature has power because it challenges us to think differently, Emma told me during a recent visit home. But organizing the boycott taught us that we have power to stand up for our beliefs and defend the teachers who inspire us. The controversy also led to broader changes in how our district approaches curriculum decisions. There's now a formal process for reviewing challenged materials that includes input from teachers, students, parents, and community members. More importantly, there's greater recognition that education should prepare students for a diverse world rather than sheltering them from different perspectives. But the most significant impact has been on how I think about the purpose and power of education. The experience taught me that great teaching isn't just about covering curriculum or raising test scores. It's about inspiring students to think critically, question assumptions, and stand up for their beliefs. The students who boycotted their graduation didn't just defend their literature teacher, they demonstrated that they had internalized the lessons about moral courage and intellectual integrity that great literature teaches. They proved that education had succeeded in its most important goal, creating thoughtful, engaged citizens who are willing to fight for what they believe is right. If you're an educator facing pressure to sanitize your curriculum or avoid controversial topics, know that you're not alone in this struggle. Students and parents who value critical thinking and intellectual freedom will support you if you have the courage to stand up for educational integrity. For students who see their teachers being silenced or their curriculum being censored, remember that you have more power than you think. Your voices matter, your opinions count, and your actions can create change that extends far beyond your individual classroom or school. For parents and community members, understand that education at its best is designed to challenge students, not comfort them. Great literature, honest history, and rigorous science should push students to think critically about complex issues and develop their own informed opinions. If you want your children to be prepared for college, careers, and citizenship in a diverse democracy, they need exposure to different perspectives and challenging ideas. Censoring curriculum to avoid discomfort ultimately does a disservice to students who will face a complex world after graduation. My classroom is still filled with diverse books that reflect the full spectrum of human experience. Students still read authors like Toni Morrison, Sandra Cisneros, and James Baldwin, alongside Shakespeare, Dickens, and Hemingway. They still write essays that challenge them to think critically about justice, identity, and moral courage. But now they also know that education is worth fighting for, that intellectual freedom requires constant vigilance, and that sometimes the most important lessons happen when students and teachers stand together to defend the right to think, question, and learn. Because sometimes, when they try to silence the teacher, the students find their own voice. Sometimes, when they ban the books, students discover the power of the very ideas they're trying to suppress. And sometimes, when they try to control education through fear and censorship, they create the very critical thinkers and engaged citizens they were trying to prevent. The graduation ceremony that was supposed to celebrate compliance became a demonstration of conscience. The students who were supposed to quietly accept censorship instead became advocates for intellectual freedom. And the teacher who was banned from graduation witnessed the most important lesson of all. That education succeeds when it creates students courageous enough to defend the principles they've been taught. Literature has power because it tells the truth about human experience in all its complexity. And sometimes, that truth inspires students to change the world, starting with their own graduation ceremony.